Welcome. It is with great pleasure I'm sitting in front of you to talk about some of the questions you asked in our Instagram Q&A. Before I do that, I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm sure you know by now I'm known as the KOV, but you can just call me Jasper. We're going to start off with the watch on my wrist. In this case, it's a rather large one. Also, if you translate it to the nickname, which is Padalone, it's Italian for frying pan. I'm sure Dario can agree on that with his Italian mother tongue. Anyways, this watch is 38 millimeter. It is not housed in a regular oyster casing that we know from Rolex, but rather a very elegant, oversized dress watch, yet in steel. So it's quite sporty, even though it's not an oyster case, and comes on a riveted oyster stretch. Quite a nice example that we have for sale. It's a reference 8171, and it is accompanying me in this cool video.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. This is Jasper Leifring from Amsterdam Vintage Watches.
Amazing. Love this watch.
So first of all, thank you for asking all these questions. Dario selected a couple of them that we're gonna discuss here live. I'm just gonna do it one by one, starting with this question from Eldad Kleiman. What is the most loved and the least loved thing in the industry? That is a great question. The most loved, what instantaneously comes to mind, has to be the community that it creates. It's cheesy, I know. However, if I'm sitting in a restaurant or if I'm at a bar or at a birthday party and I see somebody wearing a cool vintage watch, I immediately feel the urge to talk to him about it, and usually it's the other way around too. Then I'm not talking about the middle of the mall Hulk or Submariner kind of guys, modern ones, because they tend to have little less information and passion about it. Again, this is just generalized my opinion. But I really enjoy that. And secondly, whenever I'm abroad, whether it's in Turkey or in Bali or wherever I am, people reach out and they ask me to meet for coffee, or they want to show them their restaurant. They invite me to eat over at their place. They never met me, but just because we have this mutual interest of watches, it kind of creates a well, not only respect, but I would also say trust. So even in the industry, it's mind-boggling if I would tell my parents or any other 70 or 75-year-old person that people are wiring 200,000 or 100,000 or even 5 or 10,000 euros to somebody they've never met for a product they've never seen or never held in their life. That's crazy, and to me that's beautiful, and I think the watch world excels in that, so I very much appreciate that. The thing I least like, there's a multitude of things I don't like. First comes to mind the safety, which is always a hazard in some certain places like Paris or London. That's very inconvenient. I would say people that are pushing the narrative that watches ought to be bought for financial reasons, that it's a good investment or whatever. In a different video on my KOV channel, spoke about investing in watches, and I think that narrative should be handled very much with care and shouldn't be used to take away funds from gullible buyers. Lastly, I would say regarding the vintage watch market, if I come back to the gullible buyers part, people pushing the narrative or taking the angle that there's any relevance in vintage box or papers, especially with Rolex, or misusing certain terms like new old stock or unpolished, that kind of stuff, that kind of grinds my gears. It's not so annoying to me, but I think this should be addressed. Next question is vintage view. Watches you disliked but now love, and vice versa. That's a great question. The first watch that I really did not enjoy on a picture, but I did very much on my wrist, has to be the 16628, so the Yachtmaster in yellow gold. Firstly, I started out with only steel watches, or perhaps white gold or platinum, but I had an adversity against yellow gold or diamond set watches. Of course, now it's the total opposite. I absolutely adore gem set pieces, but back in the days this wasn't the case, and due to its bulkiness in nature, I mean 40 millimeters quite large, and also the bezel being in yellow gold, it's really a chunk of gold on your wrist, and the white dial specifically was so blatant, so in your face. It's actually quite gaudy. The contrasting hour markers in jet black, it just didn't make sense to me. It was just a kingpin kind of watch for people without any taste. But I stumbled upon one that it was too good to not to buy. And I started wearing the watch, and I have to admit, I absolutely fell in love with it. I think I wore the watch for like 3 months straight, which is very rare for me. And at a later stage, I bought the watch I think we traded now 20 to 25 of the 16628, and at least half of them with white dial. So the version I dislike the most is the one I like the most now at this moment. So that is a very cool watch. Another watch that comes to mind is the Ellipse, which I thought was like an old guy's watch. It's like the watch your grandfather has, but now I do understand it's a watch that has to grow on you. Now I do understand the perfect symmetry, the perfect proportions that, of course, the golden ratio is known for. So very much like the Ellipse. A lot of variants are also there, even stone dials, ones with the lapis dial, onyx dial we sold. But just purely the shape and the design, it's amazing to me that I didn't like it back then. Luckily, I gained a little bit more experience and my taste evolved. The Pasha, Cartier Pasha, specifically on a metal bracelet, I would say, in yellow gold preferred. And I like the grill. Yes, I do. It's terrible, I know, but therefore it's also very cool. And it's a Gerald Genta design. And lastly, an oddball, the 116600. So it's a modern Rolex, and generally, I'm not very fond of the designs of modern Rolex, as you might know, yet this watch was produced quite in a short period of time, I believe from 2014 to 2016 or so, and then it was discontinued. So this is indeed, it has the maxi dial, it has a lot of traits from the modern Submariner, like the maxi dial or Sea Dweller, no cyclops on the crystal, it has Carachrome bezel, yet the case proportions are better, so the lugs are in the maxi lugs. And it's 40 millimeter instead of, I think they make now 43 millimeter. So it's quite an interesting one. It kind of blends the neo vintage and the modern ones, but it wasn't popular, and maybe that's one of the reasons why I do like it now. And most importantly, I would say the Aquanaut, which is a watch I very much enjoy. I hated it at first. It didn't make any sense. It didn't spoke the DNA of Patek to me. Yet, of course, it has become a very quintessential watch in the Patek Philippe lineup, but I'm mainly aiming at the 5065 and 5066, or by extension 5060, the first ones. I very much like those, even on the chunky bracelets. So the 5167 also comes on a metal bracelet, which I don't like. It's a little bit psycho-ish bracelet, but the earlier ones, I fell in love with them the first time I bought a 5065J, so a yellow gold one. And it's just a very cool bracelet, but obviously on rubber it's also amazing. And I'm starting to grow very fond of the Neptune. It's not there yet, but definitely in 2 years or so, I'm a big Neptune supporter. I can feel it already. Watches that I like, liked back then and dislike now. Not per se the watch, but I'm inclined to say the Speedmaster. Again, there's nothing wrong with the watch, and I genuinely support buying a Speedmaster for your collection, especially if you have like 4,000 euros or whatever. A 90 Speedmaster is a great buy. It's great quality, it's great aesthetics, it's great history, but there also lies the problem. The history is being repeated so often, and so many, it's just, Omega is milking this model to an extent that it kind of annoys me. So every time I look at the watch now, it reminds me of how much they're pushing this first watch worn on the moon stuff. So it's not per se that I dislike the watch, but more the feeling that I get that's associated with the watch at this very moment. And the same goes to say for the Royal Oaks, but specifically the modern ones, because I absolutely adore vintage Royal Oaks. The mid-size are cool, even the jumbo ultra thins I like, but it's becoming the next Hublot, and I already said this, but you know, all these limited editions and all these cartoons that they put on these Royal Oaks, and the collaborations with artists, music artists or whatever, just the popularity, they're kind of destroying it for, in feeling at least, for me, and I know many other people that feel very fond of this brand because I still appreciate the brand because of its historic significance, but this kind of bothers me. Next up, name a couple things you don't like about Rolex. Okay, Casper van der Look is asking this question. That's a great one. Starting off just with modern Rolex, the watches themselves. They're quite bulky, so the contemporary ones I'm talking about, which I do not like. Apart from a couple models, I mean modern Daytonas and even the Oyster Flex, I kind of like it. It wears comfortable. Modern Yachtmasters, I'm not talking about the Yachtmaster 2, obviously. I would like the Sky Dweller if it was sized more proportionally. But just the bulky ones, the maxi cases, that kind of stuff I don't like. Their tendency to prioritize functionality over historical importance or the aesthetic parts of things. So when you service your watch at Rolex, a vintage watch, we all know these stories how they swap the dial out for a Luminova dial or service hands and that kind of stuff. And if you do want to preserve the utmost of the originality and the history, you have to send it to Rolex Patrimony in Geneva, and you end up waiting a year or longer, and the bill is extremely high. So I do find that to be annoying, since the watches are created to last very long, and I also think it's an important part to preserve their history. And that brings me to a next point, which also really grinds my gears on Rolex, is that they do not fully seem to grasp or even try to understand their history, since on their Instagram account they're posting so many incorrect Rolex models, vintage ones, like pump pusher Daytonas with Oyster on the dial, the 6542 they posted with all service parts, only like modern components blended into a vintage watch. That kind of shows me that they do not really care about it. And even in their book, the first released book, written by Nicholas Volks about the Submariner, there are quite some discrepancies in their view of originality and the collector's view of originality, and there are just blatant mistakes in there too. So they don't seem to really care about that part, which annoys me. But then again, that's also how they create business for me, because if their CPO program would be very much up to date and they would have all this in-house knowledge, then I'm no competitor to Rolex. Luckily, this is where our business model starts, right? So I also kind of think it's a good thing for me, at least. But lastly, I would say that people associate Rolex with the wearers of them, which you shouldn't. So some people think Rolex wearers are douchebags and therefore it's a shitty brand. Well, that makes no sense. Firstly, their clientele is super diverse. If you compare it to many other brands, it's way more diverse, regardless if you're black or white or fat or skinny or a girl or a guy or 18 or 65. You belong to the target audience of Rolex. I think that's very interesting that they managed to be perceived like that. And lastly, also, some people limit Rolex to only one style. Like the style they associate Rolex now with are these bulky or flashy tool watches kind of stuff. And then people people very much underestimate the richness of the Rolex catalog over the years. For example, the watch I'm wearing right now, when people say, I don't like Rolex, why not? Well, I don't like the looks of it. But what are the looks of a Rolex? Because they created everything. They created vintage dress watches too, right? So I dislike that. I made a video about how the stupidity of mitigating Rolex influence over the years, and that it's foolish to dislike the brand as a whole. I made a very, if I may say so myself, eloquently, well, now I'm not being eloquent at all. I made a video about it, just watch the video before you comment. I think it would definitely give you some insights, and feel free to disagree, but come with a substantiated reason why after you watch the video. Thank you. Next up, Ferdos. Thank you for buying the watch box we created together with Mr. A. We sold it for charity. He's one of the buyers, so appreciate that. His question is, when will you get in the ring with Adam Golden? I have this feud with Adam Menta going on for quite some years, but it's a total Fugazi feud. It's made up. We're great friends. We do a lot of business together, and we appreciate each other dearly. He sends me many nudes, which isn't a joke, unfortunately. So I'm definitely happy to go into the ring with him because he's one of the very few players that is smaller than me. And his shirt is always torn up already, so it doesn't matter even. So I'm happy, Adam, if you're watching, I'm happy to go toe-to-toe. Justin Main is up next. What's your thoughts on 36mm watches being too small? I have a small wrist and find 30mm the best. Well, there are very few people that I know that think 36mm watches are too small. Historically, it's quite large even. Seems Watches posted a very interesting graph where it displays the period of time and the average size, and 36 overall is quite a decent size, even on the bigger side. Personally, my sweet spot is between 31 and 35-ish, 36 for a dated, for example. The proportions are just correct, but it also depends on what kind of style the watch is. If it's a diverse watch, it only makes sense to have it bigger, to have it more legible. Same goes to say for pilots' watches or whatever, right? So it depends on what category of the watch it is. So by extension, you cannot limit the size or your preference to one size, because for me a dress watch might look great, or a vintage Cartier might look great in 30mm, whilst a tool watch can go up to 38 for me personally. And again, it depends your personal preference and your size. Don Vintage Watches, what is the most special Datejust 36 reference in your opinion? Well, if we're talking purely reference, so the rarest reference, I would argue is the 1605, so it's from the 16XX series, made in the 1960s and 70s. And the 1605 is characterized by a piranha bezel. So that's the finish on the bezel. I've happened to own one, and I know of one other in existence. And it's interesting that he shared this question, because I just received 2 days ago from a non-watch guy, so he's not in the industry, a picture of a 1605 that he inherited. So that's only the third 1605 I've ever come to know. So I would say that's one of the rarest, but if you look at like sub-reference, for example, if you divide it into metals, the 6604 in platinum that Watches in Rome has also perhaps one of maybe 2 or 3, but again, that's so not just the 6604, but specifically one in platinum, or specifically one in a special metal. I would say those are also very rare, but just by base of reference, I think the 1605 is very high up there. Lastly, fine horology. Does the criteria of watches you look for Amsterdam Vintage Watches differ from the ones you look for yourself? Well, obviously, if you're running a business, you have to also supply kind of you have to cater to the demand. So if there's a very high demand in specific type of dates with a champagne dial, just saying something, then I would definitely be more inclined to buy those. However, I do feel like it works best if you're your own target audience. So I like to attract the clientele that enjoys our style and enjoys our taste, because then we are able to help the best. If you walk the walk and talk the talk, it's easier, right? People understand you from the get-go instead of having to explain something you don't inherently feel. So I do tend to shift towards watches that speak to me personally. Also, because if it doesn't sell, then at least I get to enjoy them. And in the past, I've made the mistake of buying watches purely for financial gain, which isn't necessarily a mistake, because if you sell those watches and you gain more money, you can use that money to put into the watches you actually like, obviously. But if it doesn't sell, then these watches really bug me. So they really annoy me. Every time I open the safe, I go to the bank, I see the watch in the safe. It's really annoying to me. So I try to stay away from that because it brings negative energy. But watches for my personal collection, I also look at diversity. You know, I want something that is rather unusual, whilst commercially sometimes it's better to go for the watches that everybody wants. So I try to make a nice mix and balance. But if you look at our Instagram feed, for example, you can see the great diversity and variety in watches we have offered. So I like to say that would attest to our diversity in taste and willingness to learn more about other models too. Because if you only stick to one watch, you will never learn to appreciate more, or learn to appreciate some stuff less because you understand them better. But I would say that that would be my answer. Well, I hope you like this video. I do appreciate the questions, but I always appreciate comments. I'm looking to learn from you guys too. So if you disagree or agree with me, make sure also to comment it. We might in the next video also talk about your comment or your question. So that is very much appreciated, and make sure you subscribe. Thank you.